Good afternoon, rather. How's everybody doing? Must be a slow day. Nobody's here in class. Seats are less full. So, I am pleased to have you all here today and talk and bear with us. And today we're going to take a dark turn, if you like, if you don't like the government, a great turn if you like the government. So it's going to be a different kind of talk than we've done before, where you're not going to see some things that we've seen. And by the way, I just want to say, I haven't read everyone's reflection papers, but I have read a lot of people's reflection papers from my class. And how many of you already knew what life cycle assessment was? But
See one
not
there.
a lot of you until we had that talk. Was that new to a lot of you? The LCA company? Well, good thing we did that then. So I'm very pleased. So today I am delighted to bring to you Will Layden. Will is the Vice President of the American Wood Council, and he doesn't spell it like my name. We are not related.
No, no relation.
Layden instead of Layton. So anyway, Will is a 2015 graduate from political science at Clemson. He went on to Washington, D.C., and I met him when he was a congressional aide to Congressman Bruce Westerman, the forester in Congress. He later went on to the House Committee on Natural Resources subcommittee staff that Congressman Westerman was chair of before he came to the American Wood Council as Vice President of Government Affairs. And Will is going to talk us through the policies that are involved in sustainable buildings and things like that. But he's also going to talk a little bit about that terrible mess that is how policy is made. So yeah. Welcome, Will, and let's give him a big hand.
Thanks, Pat. Appreciate it. First off, I want to thank everybody for showing up here today. As Pat mentioned, Will Layden, I work for American Wood Council, Vice President of Government Affairs. I'm a lobbyist, sorry. What I'm going to try and do today here is to sort of give you a peek behind the curtain and talk about really what you've already covered in this seminar before from a policy perspective. So Pat mentioned whole building life cycle design. You guys heard from an ethicist. You've seen the role that wood products play in the carbon story. All of those things really impact policy and policy making, and want to talk a little bit about that today. So 3 things that we're going to try to accomplish here in this class, or in this seminar, excuse me. First is a real high-level overview of the policy creation cycle. So the sausage of Washington, D.C., how something goes from a concept to a bill to a law to a regulation, and really what that kind of means for you all, for future engineers, future architects here in this country. Second, we're going to touch briefly on some of the key policy challenges that are kind of facing the wood products industry specifically, and then sustainable building and design. We'll talk a little bit about current administration, what their goals are, and then finally, I want to end by challenging you all. You guys constitute the next generation of architects and engineers, people who are going to be building sustainable buildings and building with wood products. I mean, you don't take this class unless you're at least remotely interested in kind of what sustainability means. And you play an outside role in kind of directing how policy is shaped in the future. So at the end of this, we're going to have a little bit of a conversation about, like, what do you think the role of the federal government should be in sustainable building policy? What do you think your kind of job is to play, or where you see the threats and opportunities are? So kind of keep that in the back of your mind as I'm rattling through here. Again, we'll be interacting. I'm going to be calling on people. So want to like make you aware of that in the beginning. A couple of ground rules, especially as we get into this. I'm from BC. If you have a question, shout, interrupt. I don't want to sit here and just drone on you guys for an hour. I'd like to actually, get to know you a little bit, tell you guys a little about AWC and why I'm so passionate about wood products and building sustainably. So we'll get started here. Just again, Will Layden graduated from Clemson in 2015, went up to Capitol Hill. Graduated political science degree, always wanted to work on Capitol Hill, and had no idea that I wanted to get into sustainability policy or trees or anything like that. I joined the Natural Resources Committee because I liked hunt, hike, and fish, and learned really quickly there's a lot of really cool stuff that we're doing from a building perspective in the built environment that connects back to the land that I care about. And that was really the underlying driver. From there, went to work for Congressman Bruce Westerman, which Pat mentioned. He's a trained ag engineer, actually. That was his start. He worked for Mid-South Engineering based out of Arkansas. They built sawmills. They still do. And he's a licensed forester. So got to crash course in all things that you guys know and care about. Again, I'm a political science major. I can't do math to save my life. But what I can tell you is the connection, again, between the work that you're doing and the trees and the environment and the benefits that you get from out of all those things. Wrote a couple of bills, Trillion Trees Act, was mentioned in the State of the Union, worked on several farm bill cycles, and then most recently jumped over to the American Wood Council at the start of the year to do their government relations. So American Wood Council, it's a trade association. Does anybody know what that is? Stunned silence, great. Trade associations just collectively are a group of like business or like manufacturing things that advocate together. So American Wood Council, as the name probably suggests, is we represent the structural wood products industry. So we represent about 86% of all structural wood products. Weyerhaeuser, the folks that are putting on this seminar, is a member of ours. And what we do as AWC is we advocate on their behalf collectively, whether that's for educating folks about the value of sustainable products, whether that's our engineering teams actually putting together codes work and doing all the stuff with code and fire officials, to what I do, which is, again, managing our state, federal, and local relations. So going in and talking to everybody from Congressman Duncan here in South Carolina to whomever will listen about wood products. Importantly, though, this is, again, a conversation about me. I would like to know a little bit about you, but there's more people than I was expecting, which is good. So just by a show of hands, hands up if you're an engineer. Okay, so mostly engineers. Sweet. We work with a ton of them. We have a bunch of them on staff that work on a lot of code level stuff. Architecture folks, anybody? All right, sweet. You guys are building the buildings. Forestry? We got one, sweet.
Wildlife.
1, 2, kind of maybe. Wildlife, sweet. Any political science majors? Someone get lost? All right, cool. Juniors? Sweet. Seniors? Super seniors? All right. Awesome. Well, that's great. It gets a little bit, gives me an idea of kind of who I'm talking to. And again, what I'm going to do here is we're going to jump right into the policy stuff. And I'm going to go hot and heavy. We're going to go and essentially condense an entire, 3.5 years of Clemson political science degree in about 20 minutes. So if there's someone on here that's like, wait, dude, you talk really fast, slow down, explain it to me, just jump in. And again, if you want to have a little bit more depth or detail, happy to jump in there too, because again, I'm trying to provide that high level to provide the framework so that we can talk about some of the key policy issues that we're facing today. So top level, we're going to go talk about policy. What the hell is it? The policy cycle, separation of powers, how a bill becomes a law, and then federal regulation, how it's actually implemented. And then we'll talk a little bit briefly about how American Wood Council kind of fits into that morass. So in general, policy as a definition is just a deliberate set of guidelines to achieve a rational outcome. That's all it is. Any organization really can have a policy. Clemson has plenty of them. Pat told me today that TikTok's banned on campus. Is that true? Can you not just use it on Wi-Fi, or does it just not work? Wi-Fi, okay. So that is in itself a policy. The end goal there from Clemson's perspective is probably preventing espionage or making sure you pay attention in seminars like this. But they probably can't make it illegal for you to scroll TikTok. But it can change your decision making by banning it on the Wi-Fi and making sure, again, like I said, you're paying attention to when folks like me are up here droning on. For our purposes today, we're going to be focusing on federal policy making. So just the set of guidelines that the federal government or sometimes state government creates to achieve the rational outcome, again, in our case, the use of sustainable building products. You've heard, I should jump in here and say that corporate policy as well plays a role in sustainable building. You probably heard from Jamestown, I think, earlier this year about, you will hear from Jamestown in a little bit about their forestry story. And that plays into their corporate environmental and sustainability guidelines. That's corporate policy. It plays a role. Today, we're just going to talk about the federal stuff. Critical distinction. Policy is not law. The law can compel and prohibit behavior. Like, for instance, if you shoot somebody, you go to jail. Please don't shoot somebody. That's the thing. Policy just guides folks towards the action which is hopefully going to achieve that desired outcome. That make sense? Get some head nods. In many cases, policy guides the implementation of law as mentioned. So again, think about what we're dealing with right now up on Capitol Hill. So Congress is currently considering the funding for Israel, right? Assuming that both House and Senate pass a measure this weekend and get signed to the president, providing Israel more funding, they're passing a law. The administration's implementation of that funding sets the policy on Israel. Make sense? Kind of, sort of. So we'll break it down a little bit further as we go throughout this conversation. And again, if you've got questions, please jump in. 4 general types of public policy, and this is again a political scientist named Ted Lowy has proposed these. They again provide the general buckets in which public policy sort of falls into: distributive, redistributive, regulatory, and constituent. So throwing it out there, what do you think a distributive policy is? Kind of, getting close. I'll start calling up people. Salmon shirt. What do you think? Yeah. Close. So distributive is there's a limited amount of resources to go around from the federal government's perspective. Distributive is simply where we're putting it. So it's an allocation of resources, whether that's tax dollars, whether that's research funding, whether that's a military base in your district. You're aiming to provide, from the federal government's perspective, goods and services without significantly reducing the availability of benefits for another group. That's all it is. We're just trying to move pieces of the pie around. Second question, redistributive. Okay, so we know what distributive, what's redistributive? Pretty much, you got it. So think about tax. Think about affordable housing policy. Taking something where typically in our system, you take something from someone who's got a lot of money, a lot of resources, you give it to someone who's less fortunate. Regulatory, that's where the federal government or state government aims to control or regulate a type of behavior, whether it's don't smoke here, don't use TikTok, or in our cases, control emissions and pollutants from manufacturing. And constituents a little bit different than all 3 of these, and this is getting a little bit back to the folks who were saying it's like kind of something everybody has to follow. Constituents are like representative of like the preferences and values of a public. So this is where a lot of your like social policy comes in, and to a degree, some types of federal funding fall into it, like just hardcore fiscal conservatives would probably call spending a constituent policy, but that's again open for debate. So another question to the group: which ones of these do you think apply the most to sustainable building? Raise your hand if you think it's distributive. Got 1. Okay. Redistributive. 2. Regulatory? Pretty right. Constituent. So the answer is trick. It's all 3. Sorry. You're spot on regulatory, and we're going to talk about that. I mean, at the end of the day, I represent manufacturers. We want to be able to manufacture these products here in the United States, and we have to deal with a variety of regulatory issues that are going to make that either more expensive or impossible for us to do. But there's also important things, especially when we start talking about sustainable building, because building with wood, as I'm sure you guys understand, is a new thing. And we're trying to incentivize a market to change that hasn't changed in 100 years. And so when you talk about distributive, you're taking things like research dollars and you're giving that to folks like the Wood Utilization and Design Center that want to be able to teach new architects and engineers how to put a joist together. Or you're looking at a constituent thing, actually, where someone's social belief in reducing carbon emissions is now going to influence federal procurement. Redistribution applies as well. Have you looked at buying a house recently? I know I certainly have, and I certainly can't. And that's something we'd like to address from the light frame construction side, certainly. So we'll talk a little bit about this thing called the policy cycle throughout this conversation today. And in general, this is sort of how the sausage gets made in a really, really broad sense. This is, again, political science. Young and Quinn laid this out, 6 basic parts. The critical takeaway here is that it's not, this is never a linear model, right? It's circular, yes, in like a particular, or how it's displayed, it's circular, but you should look at these as like kind of different stages along policy creation and things that happen constantly. So again, just dealing with a particular type of policy issues, you're going to have constantly different entities, trying to set new agendas, trying to create new policies. And it kind of continues to go over and over and over again as people fight for a scarce amount of resources. Does anyone have kind of questions about this cycle in particular? Because it's what is the rest of this conversation to be built off of. Good deal. So we'll talk quickly about the separation of powers, and then how a bill becomes a law, and then the federal regulation. That's a really good question. Yeah, so is that a Hillsborough Hops hat too, by the way? All right, sweet. Yeah, my better half's from Hillsborough, actually, so go Hops. So the gentleman on the Hops hat up there asked, is this an infinite loop? Are we always doomed to kind of continue to fight the same policy battles over and over again? I'll try to give my non-cynical DC answer, which is yes. Certainly that you can get to a point, you can get to a culmination point on a particular set of issues. But in reality, I would say that the political scientists who developed this model would say, yes, absolutely. You can, at some point, you can put an issue to bed. It is fixed forever. But in practice, I actually think that the answer is yes. Even when you achieve a solution that is publicly agreed upon, you still constantly have to maintain the program. You have to evaluate the program. And frankly, human beings and the society we create is a flawed system. And folks are inherently going to try and take advantage of that. And you have to make policy that adapts. If we were to snap our fingers and say, okay, look, every single building tomorrow is made out of mass timber, which would be great, and it's all the sustainability stuff, I'm certain that we would find challenges in the way that was implemented or unintended consequences of how that impacts people. So, any other questions? Cool.
Someone will take it to court.
Yeah, well, and someone will take it to court. That's the other thing too. Yeah, you may have a good, forest management policy, and all of a sudden you're getting sued by a group who doesn't agree with it, and now the whole process gets to start over again. We're going to talk about the separation of powers, and then we're going to talk about a little bit of how a bill becomes a law, and then how a federal reg becomes a federal regulation. Just to contextualize how the different complex parts work together. So it's key to ensure everybody understands the distinction of 3 branches of government. I'm sure we all cover this in like high school civics class, but I'll just go over it again. Legislative writes the laws, executive carries them out, and judicial reviews the laws. Remember, though, again, that law is not policy. If you go back to that previous slide, think about that cycle somewhat. The start of the model is defining the program. Which branches of government can define the program or define the problem, define the agenda? Throw it out there. All of them. You're totally right. Judiciary less so, but even with an activist judicial court, they can still have an outsized influence in setting the agenda of our policy creation here in the United States. Which branches can select different alternatives? Again, your answer is sort of kind of all of them. Judicial, again, less so, but they can still review existing law and regulation to change which outcome we can even select. Which branches can implement policy? Well, that's pretty clear. That's mostly the executive branch. Provide oversight, again, pretty clear, defined in the Constitution. That's generally the legislative branch. But again, the judiciary sort of gets involved. If this is starting to seem kind of convoluted and confusing, that's because it is. It was designed that way. Our founders created this three-pronged system that's constantly tugging at itself in order to keep power in check and prevent tyranny. In practice, what that actually really means, though, is you get a lot of inefficiency. You get a lot of folks who are fighting over the same thing. You have a lot of folks who are all trying to both at the same time set the policy, set the agenda, do the review, and it can get fairly confusing and make even very simple problems much more complex. And that's even before you get to the politics of all of it, which is, again, underpinning all of this. So I'll give you an example of just, again, how kind of much there's a morass up in Washington, D.C. The General Accounting Office, which is the federal agency that provides oversight and audits the federal government, identified in a report to Congress this past year that there are 94 separate initiatives across 11 different agencies that just deal with green building in the non-federal space. So that's private things. That's not buildings that the federal government owns. That's not their own procurement. That's not anything that was built by the Department of Defense. Nothing. That's 94 separate programs, all to deal with this concept of sustainable building. How do we know what's working? How do you evaluate where the gaps are? All of that's a fairly complex challenge. Quickly, how a bill becomes a law. So lawmaking is one of the chief ways that the federal government can kind of kick this cycle off. Again, yes, policy, so law is not policy, but law can direct policy. And a lot of times what you can do is the Congress goes, okay, the will of the people says, federal government, go do this. This is how that starts. If everybody watched Schoolhouse Rock as a kid, I don't know, I may be dating myself somewhat, if anyone remembers how that works. The children's song still certainly applies. Congresswoman Pat introduces a bill setting the agenda. We want a bill with all wood products. From there, it would get referred to a committee process, which is going to be that policy formulation part of that process. And then it's going to go through a hearing and a markup process, which is the selection and that oversight component too that we talked about a little bit. And then it'll get referred to the floor, where it's going to fight for time and attention, which is, again, that selection of the preferred policy option. Maybe you have a great idea that you want to get enacted into law. Well, hey, now it's got to compete against a variety of different things that are, trying to get Congress's attention, including, the war that just popped off, the constant federal funding, everything. Let's assume it's gotten out of committee, got marked up, sent to the floor, got out of the Rules Committee, gets voted off the House floor, just saying. Now it has to repeat the cycle all over again in the Senate, where it does the exact same thing over again, gets referred back to committees, gets back to the Senate floor. And then assuming that the bills match and they're identical, which if not, they have to go through another committee process. It gets signed into law and it gets sent to the president's desk for his or her signature, printed into law and codified. Again, if you think this is complex, it is. Cynically, the legislative branch really isn't designed or optimized, rather, to pass laws. It's optimized to make sure that bad ideas don't become law. It was deliberately designed to be convoluted and long and complex to ensure that folks couldn't just ram something through and oppress it on the rest of us. But that makes our jobs as policy advocates, people who care about this stuff, that much harder, because we have to do that much more work to go out and convince somebody that, hey, building with wood products or considering the building sustainability is in your best interest. So we're going to then shift to the regulatory activity, which is I'm going to see if this laser pointer thing works. Yeah, I'm trying. Okay, this part right here. Once that bill becomes a law, we kick off the process of federal regulation. And at risk of death by flowchart, this is just one of the ways that it gets done. I'm not going to talk about the individual steps of this process. Frankly, I don't even know them all, and neither does the federal government. They actually print out a whole map that people have about where a particular regulation is in terms of the draft process and what policies they've got to find. I'm not going to bore you to death today. You could take an entire class if you wanted to on that and all that sort of stuff. I mentioned this process, though, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it generally, because we're going to talk about some of the ways that regulations are going to be impacting sustainable building here in a few minutes. One of the things I want you to take away from all this, too, especially from this slide, is The key point is that Congress can grandstand all it wants. It can sit there and say, my constituents want this, that, and the other thing. They can spend months deliberating the policy, yada, yada. Ultimately, it's the federal government that has to implement that policy to achieve a desired outcome. If, again, like I say, going back to Congresswoman Pat, passes a bill that says we need to build with mass timber, the federal government then has to actually take that and say, okay, here's how we're going to allocate the resources that Congress gives us. Here's how we're going to actually mandate that the particular agencies are going to do those things. And they can choose to not implement it. They can just say, sorry, we don't want to do that. President Andrew Jackson once famously put it, well, Congress has their law. Let's see if they can enforce it. There's no obligation for the administration to actually take a law and bring it to its final conclusion or to the end of that policy cycle. And again, that's where the oversight component of Congress gets involved in terms of making sure that there's that public mandate that's saying, hey, administration, build with mass timber like we told you. At this point, too, I'm going to add that this is an important time to talk about executive orders in this overall process. The president maintains broad authority to direct the actions of his administration and of his executive branch. That includes like setting programs and policies, and presidents will frequently use this to set the agenda, to kind of actually select policy options and sort of guide the alternatives which match his or her own agenda. Again, we'll take this president as an example. Even before the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a big piece of legislation that we're going to talk about here just shortly after this slide, President Biden had signed a half dozen executive orders guiding federal rulemaking and procurement to specifically talk about climate change, talk about emissions, and some of that had to do with sustainable building. So again, thinking about, back to that cycle, I'm going the wrong direction, excuse me. Thinking back to that cycle, those executive orders are not just agenda setting, but then they're deliberately figuring out, okay, different alternatives of policy creation, and then actually doing the hard work of implementing it. So where does American Wood Council come into all this? Well, as you probably can tell from the past 20 minutes of me talking, there's a ton of cooks in the kitchen. There's a lot going on. And Congress is simultaneously evaluating stuff, and they're holding hearings, and the administration's trying to achieve their end goals. The AWC's whole purpose here, from at least the advocacy perspective, and from my perspective, my job, is to attempt to influence this policy to better benefit our members, again, the structural wood products industry. We track legislation and regulation, both of stuff that's beneficial to our members and what could hurt us, which could put our sawmills out of business. We educate people. I go in and talk to members of Congress and say, hey, listen, this is going to have an impact to your district. Here's why you should do a certain thing. We talk to staff in the administration and say, listen, as you're trying to implement this particular policy, as you're trying to deal with this particular challenge, consider using wood products. I write legislation. We highlight successes and failures of different programs that we want changed or continued. So the long and short of it, the answer is AWC tries to jump in pretty much at every single point. If I'm doing my job, I might have connections and relationships at every part of this policy cycle. Any questions? I know I just threw a lot at you. There's a lot going on here. And again, it is really how the sausage is made. A key component here is that on the Hill, we had a saying that, look, there's someone who knows the policy, there's someone who knows the politics, and then there's someone who knows the process. Understanding and mastering all three is critical for actually shaping an agenda. I mean, you can have the best idea and you can have the best friends in the world, but if you don't know where you need to push your idea in the circle, you're doomed. And conversely, there's the politics angle and there's the actual smart policy making too that all goes into it. Cool. Questions? Awesome. We're going to go on to sustainable building policy, talking about the actual stuff. And again, I think we've got about another half hour, so I'll try to keep this within 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to you guys because I want to hear your thoughts and what you view as actual challenges. So as that GAO study indicated, there's hundreds of different policies and programs and all sort of thing. And you could spend an entire semester class dealing with each individual regulation and opportunity for sustainable building. It would actually be pretty interesting from my own nerdy perspective, but we don't have that kind of time. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of them. that are going to be used kind of mostly as case studies to illustrate some of the different types and buckets of policy. Then I'm going to talk about what AWC is caring about right now. And then we'll close by having a conversation about the threats and opportunities, as I've sort of mentioned here. So I've already talked about this. The 3 case studies we're going to be using are, again, focusing on 2 distributive types of buckets and then a regulatory one. So I mentioned it already. The Inflation Reduction Act is a clear sign. It's the distributive policy. Bang on. It was a major budget reconciliation bill passed in August 2022. It's almost $1 trillion of federal spending directed at an ambitious set of programs ranging anywhere from, again, sustainable building, like we're going to talk about, but solar panels, everything in between. It directed the General Services Agency, which is the second biggest federal landlord behind the Department of Defense. It gave them $2.15 billion to either build or retrofit existing federally owned buildings with materials that reduced carbon emissions. And it also authorized FEMA to consider using some of these products too. This policy, the IRA, is crucial. Again, as I mentioned, sustainable building and building with wood products generally in a large way. I mean, we still build a lot of light frame construction, but building with mass timber, with CLT, with glulam. That is a new thing for the construction industry. And the market's it doesn't want to change. It's expensive. Building with, we've had 100 years of building with traditional building materials like concrete and steel. Again, they're very emissions intensive, but the market's not going to buck that just because we want it to. We have to figure out a way, either via carrots and sticks, to get it to change and adapt. And this is a huge carrot. Again, if GSA can demonstrate to a sawmill manufacturer, or sorry, a CLT manufacturer or a sawmill that, hey, they're going to build so much more square footage with a particular type of material, okay, well, that might be a market. It may not be all the market, but may be enough to justify to an investment community that, hey, we can go site a new sawmill here in South Carolina, or we can invest in a new type of building material. Questions about IRA? Just in terms of scale, $2.1 billion is I think 2% of the overall spending. It is a huge bill, and there are some great resources that go much further into detail about the entirety of what it does that I'm happy to provide Pat some links afterwards if she wants to share it around. Congressional Research Service, IRA, is a great primer on it if you want to read it and fall asleep. Distributive policy, though, goes beyond just the IRA. This is a kind of a selected table of some of the different legislation that pertains to federal procurement of sustainable buildings. This table is dated actually a year before IRA came out, so it would include it tacked onto the bottom. And just a couple of things to note here. Note how far back this policy question goes. I mean, we've been talking about sustainable building for longer than you and I have been alive. And to our friend on the hop hats question, it's nowhere near fixed or solved. It's something that we've been dealing with for a long time. Pay attention to that, how much both the ledge branch and the executive branch have had sort of an equal split at setting that agenda. I mean, the PLs are public laws. That's something that's been signed into law, passed through that convoluted Congress process that I talked about. EOs are executive orders. That's something that the president picked up their pen and said, I'd like to do this with my agency. I'd like to draw particular attention to Executive Order 13834. I'm not even going to try to do this pen thing again. It's the first EO on there. Signed in May of 2018 by actually President Trump. It required that all new federal construction and major renovations conform to applicable building energy efficiency requirements and sustainable design principles. So, across administrations, bipartisan, both Republican and Democrat, there has been a growing demand for building with sustainable wood products. And as we talk about the opportunities, as we talk about the next generation of folks who are interested in, reducing our emissions level, or at least addressing, embodied carbon in our built environment, that's got some bipartisan traction. So an opportunity for us, and something to be aware of too, as you eventually have to go build with stuff. We're going to talk about a regulatory policy. So one of the primary challenges to building with wood in the United States and building with mass timber or anything else is the ability to actually manufacture it here domestically. So again, regulatory policies, the federal government trying to set some rules in order to affect an outcome or actually take a group of people and try to guide them for. This one is specifically with air emissions. So Clean Air Act, which was passed back in the 70s, requires that the Environmental Protection Agency regulates fine particulate emissions. So we're talking about dust that's like 1/10 of the size of your human hair. Comes from wildfires, comes from road dust, and in our case, also comes from manufacturing. So sawmills make up about 1% of all the PM NAAQS emissions that are thrown off in the United States. Unfortunately, the EPA, despite our insistence, is continuing to make that number smaller. So the background level that you can't exceed if you want to continue to operate a sawmill here in the United States. Recently, actually in this past September, they put up a reg that said that would push the top level PM NAAQS emissions to essentially background level. You go outside right now, there's a certain amount of micrograms of this fine dust floating around there just because we exist and because there's fires and that sort of thing. The challenge is all of our sawmills, all of the manufacturing and energy plants in the United States have to have air permits, again, per this Clean Air Act. If they cannot demonstrate to the federal government, to the EPA, that their running that plant doesn't exceed that set level, they will not be able to operate. Well, that's really challenging because EPA is saying, okay, sorry, this number is essentially background. So you can't add anything into the equation if it's at background. So it's making it really difficult for wood products to continue to be manufactured here in the United States. It's a huge challenge that we're trying to fight, especially given how much emphasis this administration has placed on building with wood and building sustainably. And we'd like to do that here, employing Americans. So again, just an example of just one of the regulatory policies that is, again, facing our industry and the American Wood Council, and also faces the sustainable building sector as they look to try to utilize this stuff a little bit more. So a couple of oh, yeah, go ahead. Also good. You're totally right. That's a very fair point. And part of the reason why it's such a long and convoluted process is that there's not a whole lot of policy things that are clear good for bad trade-offs. It just doesn't exist. Whether that's based on people's different political beliefs, whether that's just objective fact. Now, AWC, our industry, we want clean air. And in fact, we work with the EPA extensively to ensure that our mills are incredibly clean. And we have reduced our contributions to PM NAAQS for the better part of 20 years. Currently, the United States, enjoys the cleanest air in the world. The challenge is that we're getting to a point where we can't make it any better. In this particular case, for the PM NAAQS, the argument that we're making is the vast majority of this stuff is coming from wildfire emissions. Okay, so how do you prevent wildfire emissions? You control, burn it, you thin it, or you turn it into a manufactured wood product. Okay, so if you're knocking out one of those with making it harder for sawmills to work, and also, by the way, you're knocking out more days that you can actually control burn, how are we actually fixing the problem? It's challenging, though, because on the other side of that coin, when we testified in front of the Energy and Commerce Committee, we sat next to somebody who was advocating for health, lungs, like things that we need. So there's a definite balance there.
So are other industries, I would imagine concrete has a dust load too. Are they in there doing the same thing?
You got it.
Not just wood.
It's not just wood. And, AWC has been working through the National Association of Manufacturers. So again, we were talking about trade associations at the beginning. National Association of Manufacturers is like everybody's trade association. It's the trade association of all the manufacturers. So every major industry is pretty much a member of NAM. They're helping us spearhead this effort on the combined regulatory front, because unfortunately, there's not just, this administration is pursuing a number of environmental regulations that are going to have an impact on our business. And NAM is trying to kind of beat those back where it's applicable and acceptable. But this impacts everybody. This impacts the landowners from a forestry perspective, again, from that burning. But it also impacts, stone, sand, and gravel, the folks who are actually milling this stuff. It impacts concrete and aggregate. A lot of the key components of our economy and our manufacturing capability are tied up in air permits. So not to go too far into the weeds on a very, nuanced regulatory issue, which it's certainly not the most entertaining thing in the world, but industry makes up about point sources, which is, again, stuff coming out of smokestacks, makes up about 17% of the total pie of fine particulate matter. And the vast majority of wood products is 1%. By comparison, fires are 60%. So appreciate the question, though, about trade-offs, because at the end of the day, when we're talking about distributive policy, there is always going to be someone who comes out on the short end of the stick. And that's challenging. And that's something that our policymakers and our staffs and members of Congress and whoever have to balance as they make these policies. And part of the reason why the convoluted process exists is so that the people who are coming out on the short end of the stick don't continue to get railroaded. Real quick, American Wood Council's legislative and policy priorities. We're focused really primarily on distributive regulatory policy. I talked a little bit about the regulatory issues in that last slide, but the freedom to operate, the ability to continue to manufacture here in the United States is really what we're trying to do. And it's a cumulative regulatory challenge. So from PMNACs to formaldehyde, the stuff that goes into our glues, on in between, all that stuff is impacted in our ability to operate. Additionally, we're pursuing something called Build Clean. So I think you guys have talked about environmental product declarations. We're all for reducing carbon in the built environment. Like, that is our ethos. It's in our mission statement. But we think that rather than doing a like to like, where you're saying, okay, I want to build with this green concrete versus just plain old concrete, you should take a look at the building's entire envelope. And from the start to finish, try to improve that building's total carbon footprint towards the end of its life cycle. Why? Inherently, because it benefits wood. Wood products are 50% carbon by weight. We want to see those continually utilized here in the United States. It puts Americans to work. It helps us store carbon. Additionally, we're working on something called the Farm Bill. So every 5 years, big piece of legislation is passed through Congress called the Farm Bill. It provides everything from food stamps to SNAP benefits to crop insurance, that sort of thing. In it, it specifically has a forestry title, which obviously we care a lot about, being the folks who take forests and turn them into products. And there's 3 programs that we're focused on here. The Wood Innovation Grant Program. Clemson has been a recipient of a WIG program. Pat can talk to you about it, but who's been out to Snow Family Rec Center before? All right. It used to be called Y Beach when I was here. That building, that beautiful mass timber building, was funded in part, at least the research was funded in part by a WIG grant. And so we want to see that continue to grow on and be prosperous, because frankly, we need more Clemson universities that are these incubators nationwide. We have an education accelerator grant program. So this is a seminar that was put on very generously by Weyerhaeuser and Clemson University. We need more of them. Again, you guys care about sustainable building, again, constitute the next generation of engineers. Unfortunately, we need a lot more of you. Talking to developers, end users, architects, folks who are out in the environment, they can't find enough well-trained engineers and architects who understand mass timber, who are into it, and are willing to take the risks to build with a new material. So hopefully trying to get more of y'all around through this grant program. And the final is a community facilities pilot program. So I mentioned at the top of this, there's a huge housing crisis nationwide. Houses are expensive. And we think that wood can be a solution there. Light frame construction and mass timber, advanced wood products can be a solution there. And this is a pilot project to try and insert that into some of the community facilities programs that are housed within USDA. So questions about our priorities? Cool. Finally, kind of these threats and opportunities. There are some political threats. There's an underlying opposition to sustainable building policy. There are some folks in the world who believe that climate change doesn't exist, or if they do, they're skeptical about how much federal government should be involved in talking about it. There's also conversations about total federal funding levels. The government deficit is at an all-time high. Folks are trying to shrink that, and with that means less resources to be distributed around. There's regulatory threats. Again, I've drawn on and on about it. Won't have to go on it further, but the ability to operate freely in the United States is under threat for a variety of reasons. We're trying to, again, find that healthy balance. But more importantly, there's a ton of opportunities. There's a generational demand for concern about climate change and a concern about sustainability. And wood products have a great story to tell there. Again, they're 50% carbon by weight. There are things that are manufactured here in the United States by Americans and designed by American engineers. And that's something that we really like to harness on is, regardless of where folks fall on the political spectrum or where they believe, how much human-led impact on climate change is, there are folks that are now demanding that we were, from a corporate governance strategy that they build with wood or reduce their overall carbon emissions. We'd like to harness that as a domestic industry, put more Americans to work, and again, lower our carbon emissions while we're doing it. But I'll turn it over to you. You guys have been in this seminar for a better part of, it's October, almost November now, 2 months now. What threats do you see? What opportunities do you see? Again, I'll start calling on people. All right, I'll pick on somebody then. Seahawks. Yeah, hit me. It's not a wrong answer. Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, and what I would say is that from a deforestation perspective, land finds its highest value. And so whether that's trees getting turned into ag land, whether that's trees getting turned into development, so whoever owns that piece of property is trying to make the most money. And so, the reason why we harp on sustainable forestry is that it keeps forests around. If you have a managed working forest, that means that trees are coming off the property at some point, but it's staying as trees. And that means that you can continue to recreate in that area. But certainly, and internationally especially, there's a huge deforestation challenge that faces the wood products industry generally. AWC has a really great sustainability tool, actually, that talks about regionally where our products come from. If you go and look at a grade stamp of any 2x4 that you buy in this country, we can tell you, because of American Wood Council's research, where it came from regionally and how it's sustainably managed. But we agree with you that internationally, that's not the same thing. And we talk about that kind of freedom to operate. If you push wood products manufacturing international, I can tell you the sustainability stuff is a lot worse. So land finding the highest value, we want to continue to have forests around. I mean, the people who work in this industry care about the trees and care about, hunting and fishing and being in the forest. That's my through line to the whole thing. But then also too, we want to make sure that it's, kind of still continues to be made here. Anybody else? Threats, opportunities? Absolutely. Yeah. So the opportunity was architectural demand for wood products is high. That's absolutely accurate. You couldn't build with mass timber or CLT about 5 to 10 years ago. In the most recent study, we're looking at, I think, like 3,000 or 4,000 development projects this year alone that are using mass timber. And there's even more demand from light frame construction and mixed use stuff too. So yes, there's a huge opportunity when it comes to building with wood, but we need to meet that challenge, and that's kind of a threat as well. Yeah. You want to come to DC and make some of those points for us? That's exactly out of our talking points. You're absolutely right. It being a new thing, we're breaking into a market. Hey, I don't know how to build with this stuff. I'm kind of scared. It's different. It's weird. It's not prefab pour concrete. My guys do that all the time, and that's part of the things that we want to actually address with that education accelerator grant program. Actually, is allow like places like Clemson to partner with Tri-State Technical College to make sure that the folks who are designing it and who are engineering it are also working with the contractors so that they know about both ends of the spectrum.
By the way, we do have actually a little mini building that's out at the construction science experiential learning yard so that they can learn how to build it. So they're doing that in one of their sophomore level classes now. They're putting the building together and taking it apart. So it's good.
Cool.
Very big issue. Very big issue.
All right, let me get 2 more. What else? Yes and no, but mostly yes. But per square footage, especially with it being a bespoke material and a new thing, it's just more expensive. And that's part of the role that the federal government, at least in the American Wood Council's view, should kind of play is as we're incentivizing this market, it's a sort of a chicken and egg thing. That cost will come down as the capacity to manufacture the product increases. But we don't have the demand necessarily so that the private industry says, let's go and jump in and manufacture a ton of this stuff. So where can the federal government, where can the state government reduce those pressure points to make it so that that capacity is increased? All right, last one in this time, in this question at least. Uh-huh. Yeah. You got it. Yeah, absolutely. That's something that keeps me up at night, certainly, is there are organizations out there that want hyper-specific data. I mean, going back to and all, again, well-intentioned, and going back to a lot of what the Seahawks jersey guy said about deforestation is people want to know where these things are coming from. But that's really hard when it's a 2x4. I mean, can you tell two 2x4s that are different apart? Not really. It's unless it's, again, like I said, that data is really robust. And so AWC has spent a lot of time and capital and kind of brain power on figuring out ways that we can track it on a regional scale. And going back to that grade stamp, working at with things like the Softwood Lumber Board, but the Southern Pine Inspection Bureau and that sort of thing. But it's not perfect, and it never will be. And something that may be again regulatorily infeasible if demanded by somebody who is not as educated on how who's never cruised timber, who's never been out in the woods, who doesn't actually know how a wood product supply chain works. So great question, guys. I appreciate it. Last part about it is y'all's role in the policy process. Again, you guys are junior, senior level architecture and engineering students, but you're taxpayers and you're advocates. And frankly, if you have taken an hour out of your day to listen to me talk, it demonstrates to me through your actions that you care a little bit about sustainable policy. So how do you think that you wrap into this conversation? Let's go back to that kind of policy cycle that I talked about. Where do you see your role? You got it. That's number one, is at the end of the day, supporting candidates, supporting folks that understand sustainability policy and want to actually address this problem head on is number one. That's certainly a definite way to involve here. Yeah, absolutely. He over there said, that you guys are going to be in the field. You're actually going to be doing this stuff. And the reality is that the folks who are in the field are the ones that set the agenda. When you go and get a job with a major development company, if you go work for Balfour Beatty at the end of this, you will be faced with questions of what material should we use? How do we make this project work? How do I make sure that I get promoted in improving my company's bottom line? All of that is going to happen, and it's whether or not you, as the person in the system, want to set that agenda and create that change to build with sustainable products. So, anyone else before I wrap up here and let you go? I think we got about 5 more minutes left. I'm happy to answer any questions too. Pat?
I think that I would like to invite you all to think about spending a summer in DC as an intern at either Congress or some of the companies and things that have government affairs options there, like AWC, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, American Institute for Architects, the Professional Engineers Society. All of them have internships.
And you can actually apply and go do something like this in the summer and really get a little bit more understanding about what's going on.
Yeah.
So even like we had a kid in forestry that went up for a Policy 101 event that a group of forest landowners had, and he got involved. I think Willie even met you while he was there.
It was great.
But just really having and he's back working in industry now, but having that policy knowledge is really helpful. And there are internships available. You just have to look for them. Even if you just know your congressman, you could go work for them. Call them up and say, I'm interested in coming to work. How do I do that? But look online.
Yeah, and I'll make it simpler too. I have my cards here. If you're interested in that sort of thing, come on down. It doesn't have to be in the summer. I know that for engineering students, a lot of times that's stuff that where you're working in particular with a contractor. There are fall and spring internships as well. Frankly, DC needs folks like y'all. There's plenty of kids who had a poli-sci degree and are like, okay, cool, I want to go answer telephones. The technical knowledge that you guys have gained through your Clemson education here, and especially your engineering, your architecture education, is something that is actually missing from the policy conversation more broadly. You know, AWC is a unique organization. We employ about 12 or 13 engineers and code officials to talk about some of this stuff. But you know, on the Hill, your skills are in high demand, and so. Again, happy to help work with you to place you in something that matches your interests, your expertise. If there's opportunities, we'd love to extend those to you at American Wood Council, or connect you with our partner organizations, like Pat said, you know, AIA, Softwood Lumber Board, that all sort of thing. Cool. Well, happy Halloween, folks. Appreciate the time. It's been good talking to you. So.